What you're about to hear is not just a crime story. It's the moment fear became law in America. The Molly Maguires were called terrorists, criminals, and enemies of the state. But the truth buried in these prison walls is darker than the crimes themselves. Subscribe now, because once this story begins, you won't hear American justice the same way again. The rope dropped without warning. Inside the cold stone walls of a Pennsylvania prison, a man's body fell through the trapdoor. The sound was sharp, final, and impossible to take back. Guards stood still. Witnesses said nothing. Outside the prison walls, the coal towns held their breath. Another name had been crossed off a secret list. Another Molly Maguire was dead. By the end of that day in 1877, 4 men would be executed. By the end of the year, more would follow. Newspapers called it justice. Mine owners called it peace. But in the dark tunnels beneath Pennsylvania, thousands of miners whispered a different word: war. What no one outside the prison truly understood was this: the hangings were not the end of the Molly Maguires. They were the loudest moment in a long, hidden story of fear, hunger, loyalty, and revenge. A story that began far from prison walls, deep underground, where men worked like ghosts and died like animals. And the most dangerous part of the story had not even been revealed yet. Because one man in that courtroom was lying, and another man was still watching from the shadows. The truth about how America's first domestic terror cell was built, betrayed, and destroyed begins long before the noose ever tightened. In the early 1870s, eastern Pennsylvania was powered by coal. Not oil, not gas, coal. It heated homes, ran factories, and moved trains. The coal did not come easily. It came from narrow tunnels carved into mountains. Tunnels so dark that a man could lose his sense of time. Tunnels where explosions, cave-ins, and poison gas were part of daily life. The men who worked there were mostly Irish immigrants. Many had fled famine and violence back home. They believed America would save them. Instead, they found another kind of prison. Mine owners controlled everything: wages, housing, stores, even the police. If a miner spoke up, he was fired. If he tried to organize, he was beaten. If he protested, he disappeared from the job list forever. Some towns were owned entirely by the mining companies. The law did not protect miners, it protected profit. Children worked beside their fathers. Accidents were ignored. Deaths were replaced within hours. A man who died in the morning could be replaced by lunch. Fear lived in every tunnel. Anger lived in every home. That anger needed a voice. That voice became the Molly Maguires. At first, they were not killers. They were a secret brotherhood, a shadow society passed down from Ireland, where similar groups had fought against landlords and soldiers. They met at night. They spoke in codes. They swore loyalty to one another above all else. If a mine boss beat a worker, a warning would come. If a foreman abused his power, a threat would follow. Lanterns were smashed, tools vanished, barns burned in the night. The message was clear: leave the miners alone. But fear does not sit still, it grows. As conditions worsened, warnings turned to violence, targeted violence. A mine boss shot while walking home, a supervisor stabbed in the dark, a man known for cruelty found dead near the tracks. Each killing sent shockwaves through the coal towns.
To the miners, these acts felt like justice. To the mine owners, they felt like terror. The newspapers chose a name: terrorists. For the first time in American history, an organized group using fear and violence to control behavior was labeled a domestic terror cell. The Molly Maguires became a national threat, and powerful men wanted them erased. The Pinkerton Detective Agency was hired to solve the problem quietly. No public army, no open war, just infiltration. That is when James McParland arrived. McParland was Irish, just like the miners. He spoke their language, drank in their bars, listened to their stories. He claimed to hate the mine owners. He claimed to be angry. He claimed to be one of them. They trusted him. For months, McParland lived among the miners. He attended secret meetings. He memorized names. He learned hand signs. He heard confessions spoken in low voices after long shifts underground. Every word went into his reports. Every name went onto a list. The Molly Maguires believed they were invisible. They believed the darkness protected them. They believed loyalty was stronger than money. They were wrong. By 1876, arrests began quietly, then loudly, then in waves. Men were dragged from their homes in front of their families. Some were beaten, some were chained. Many had no idea why they were arrested. Trials followed fast, too fast. Witnesses came forward who should not have known anything. Evidence appeared that no one remembered collecting, and at the center of it all stood James McParland, pointing his finger. The courtroom felt less like justice and more like theater. Jurors were often connected to mine owners. Judges rushed proceedings. Defense lawyers were ignored. The outcome felt decided before the first word was spoken. Guilty. Death sentences followed. Inside prison walls, the condemned waited. Some denied everything. Some admitted to crimes. Some stayed silent, staring at stone walls, knowing history was about to erase them. When the executions came, they were hidden from public view. No crowds, no protests, just rope, wood, and silence. America had chosen its side. But the question remained. Were the Molly Maguires criminals who used terror to control the coal fields, or were they desperate men who fought back when the law refused to protect them? And more importantly, did the man who destroyed them tell the full truth? Because as the bodies fell, whispers spread through the prison corridors. Whispers that evidence had been planted, that confessions were forced, that McParland had pushed men toward violence so he could later condemn them. If that was true, then the executions were not justice. They were an execution of the truth itself. And the most dangerous secret of all was still buried. In the next chapter, we follow James McParland deeper into the Molly Maguires' inner circle, where loyalty, lies, and murder crossed a line that could never be undone. The first warning came too late. A miner was found dead near the tracks just before dawn. No one saw who did it. No one heard a scream. By the time the sun rose over the coal hills, the message had already spread through town. Someone had crossed a line, and the Molly Maguires had answered. James McParland heard the news in a crowded tavern. He did not react. He lifted his glass, nodded like the others, and listened. Inside, his heart raced. This was the proof his employers wanted. Another killing, another step closer to prison cells filling up. But there was a problem McParland could not ignore. He had helped push this moment into existence. Weeks earlier, he had whispered doubts into the wrong ears. He had repeated rumors. He had hinted that certain mine bosses were planning betrayals. He never told anyone to kill. He never held a weapon. But he knew how anger worked. He knew how fear moved through desperate men. And now a man was dead. McParland was deep inside the Molly Maguires by then, too deep to turn back. He attended secret meetings held in back rooms in abandoned buildings. The men spoke softly. They used hand signs and codes. They trusted him with stories they had never told their wives. They talked about hunger, about children coughing from coal dust, about friends crushed underground and forgotten by the company by nightfall. They talked about bosses who laughed when men begged for safer conditions. To them, violence felt earned. McParland wrote everything down later, alone. Names, dates, places. Every detail went into reports sent quietly to the Pinkertons and mine owners. Each report tightened the noose around men who still believed he was their brother. The killings continued. Not many, not random, always targeted. a supervisor known for beatings, a mine official rumored to have cheated workers. Each death increased pressure on the state to act. Newspapers screamed about terror in the coal fields. Politicians demanded arrests. Mine owners demanded blood. Behind closed doors, deals were made. Local police were promised protection. Judges were promised support. Prosecutors were promised cooperation. The goal was not just to stop the violence, it was to end the movement forever. Arrests began in the night. Men were pulled from beds while their children cried. Some were arrested for murder, others for conspiracy, some for nothing more than being Irish and known to attend meetings. Prison cells filled fast. Inside the jails, confusion ruled. Many prisoners had no idea why they were there. They waited days without charges, weeks without trials. Guards avoided their eyes. When trials began, the courtroom felt cold. Jurors looked uncomfortable. Everyone knew the outcome was expected. James McParland took the stand. He spoke calmly, clearly. He described meetings. He described words spoken years ago. He described plans that only he could confirm. Defense lawyers tried to challenge him, but his stories were detailed, convincing, hard to break. To the jury, he sounded like truth. To the accused, he sounded like betrayal. Some men shouted his name in rage. Others stared at him in silence, trying to understand how someone they trusted could destroy them so completely. The verdicts came fast. Guilty. Death. One after another. Prison became a waiting room for the gallows. Men counted days through light through narrow windows. Some prayed, some wrote letters, some refused to speak at all. Outside, fear did not fade, it spread. Miners wondered who would be next. Families avoided gatherings. Taverns emptied early. The Molly Maguires were being erased, but the conditions that created them remained unchanged. And then something unexpected happened. Not all prisoners stayed silent. One man broke. He claimed McParland had encouraged violence, that the detective had suggested targets, that he had praised earlier attacks. The claim spread quietly through cells and courtrooms. Officials dismissed it, but doubt had entered the room. Historians would later argue about this moment. Some believed McParland was simply reporting what he heard. Others believed he crossed a line, becoming part of the very terror he claimed to expose. The truth blurred. Executions moved forward anyway.
Behind prison walls, ropes were prepared. Guards were told to keep order. Witness lists were kept short. The state wanted control, not chaos. Each execution tightened public fear and private guilt. Some mine owners celebrated. Violence in the coal fields slowed. Strikes weakened. Workers grew quiet. But the silence felt heavy, not peaceful. Because the prisons were not empty, more arrests were coming. McParland stayed in Pennsylvania, still watching, still listening. His work was not finished. He believed more members remained hidden. He believed the danger was not over. But the men he watched no longer trusted easily. Eyes followed him in taverns. Conversations stopped when he entered rooms. A whisper followed him everywhere. Snitch, traitor, liar. One night, McParland realized something had changed. He was no longer the hunter. He was being hunted. A message reached him through a frightened contact. His cover was cracking. Names were being whispered. His life was no longer safe. If the Molly Maguires discovered the full truth before the trials ended, the story would not end in a courtroom. It would end in blood. As executions continued, questions grew louder outside Pennsylvania. Were these fair trials? Was this justice? Or was this the powerful crushing the powerless, using prisons as weapons? America watched. The hangings would continue, but the biggest danger was still ahead. Because if McParland was exposed before he escaped, the final chapter of the Molly Maguires would not be written by the courts. It would be written in the dark. And someone was already waiting. The last execution began before sunrise. A thin mist hung over the prison yard as guards moved quietly, their boots scraping stone. Inside the holding cell, the condemned man stood straight, his hands shaking only slightly. He had lived his entire life underground.
breathing dust, swinging steel, trusting men who worked beside him. Now the state stood ready to end his story. Word of the execution spread quickly through the coal towns. Women closed their doors. Men avoided eye contact. Children were told to stay inside. Everyone understood what this meant. The Molly Maguires were almost gone. But almost was not enough. By 1878, the movement had been crushed by arrests, trials, and prison sentences. The hangings had done what the mine owners wanted. Strikes collapsed. Meetings stopped. Fear replaced resistance. The coal flowed without interruption. On paper, the terror threat was over. In reality, something worse had been created. The prisons were still full. The mines were still deadly. The workers were still poor. The only difference was silence. James McParland left Pennsylvania soon after. His job was finished, his reports praised, his name protected. To the public, he was a hero who saved the coal region from violence. To the miners, he was a ghost that never left. Years passed, and the story of the Molly Maguires changed depending on who told it. Mine owners said the executions brought peace. Newspapers repeated the official version. History books reduced the men to criminals and troublemakers. But in Irish homes, a different story survived. Fathers told sons about meetings held by candlelight. Mothers whispered names of men who never came home. Children learned that sometimes the law does not protect the weak, it protects the powerful. As time passed, scholars began asking questions the courts never did. Why were convictions based almost entirely on one undercover witness? Why was physical evidence so thin? Why were juries stacked with men tied to mining interests? Why were death sentences rushed so quickly? The answers pointed to something uncomfortable. The Molly Maguires were real, the violence was real, but the justice may not have been. Some historians now believe the group was less organized than claimed, more scattered, more desperate, acts of revenge rather than coordinated terror. Others argue that McParland did not just observe crimes, but shaped them, guiding anger until it exploded. If true, that means America's first domestic terror cell was not just destroyed by the prison system, it was partly created by it. The execution set a dangerous precedent. For the first time, the federal government and private industry worked together to use incarceration as a weapon against political resistance. Prison became a tool of control, not just punishment. This strategy would be repeated again and again throughout American history. Labor movements crushed, protesters jailed, voices silenced behind bars. The Molly Maguires were the beginning. Inside the coal mines, little improved. Accidents continued, deaths mounted. The same system that created the violence remained untouched. Only the resistance was gone. Some former miners said the fear after the executions was worse than before. At least before, men believed they could fight back. Afterwards, they believed fighting meant death. Prison had won. But the story refused to die. In the early 1900s, labor unions began rising again. This time, leaders studied the Molly Maguires closely. They learned from the mistakes. They avoided secrecy that could be twisted into conspiracy. They fought in the open, with numbers too large to erase quietly. The ghosts of the executed miners followed every meeting. Do not trust too easily. Do not underestimate the state. Do not believe prison is neutral. Today, the prison yard where the executions took place is quiet. No markers, no plaques, just stone and shadow. Tourists pass without knowing what happened there. The silence remains, but the legacy is loud. The Molly Maguires changed how America handles internal threats. They taught the nation that fear could justify almost anything, that labels could decide fate, that once someone is called a terrorist, fairness becomes optional. Were they criminals? Were they freedom fighters? Were they desperate men trapped in an unfair system? The answer depends on who controls the story. What cannot be denied is this:
America's first domestic terror cell did not end with the last hanging. It lived on in laws, prisons, and policies that followed. It shaped how power responds when challenged. And somewhere, deep in the coal fields, beneath layers of stone and time, the anger that created the Molly Maguires still sleeps, waiting. The danger did not end with the hangings. It moved. Late one night, long after the last rope had been cut down, a fire burned on a hill above a quiet coal town. No crowd gathered, no speeches were made, just a small flame and a few men standing in silence. They were not Molly Maguires. They were survivors, widows' brothers, sons of executed miners, men who had learned a hard lesson. If you fight the system in the dark, the system will crush you in the light. This was the moment everything changed. Across Pennsylvania, mine owners believed the threat was gone. Violence stopped, production rose, profits returned. Newspapers praised the return of order. Politicians took credit. Prisons emptied slowly as minor suspects were released. But the coal towns felt hollow.
Men worked longer hours, wages stayed low, injuries were still ignored, death notices still appeared without apology. The only difference was that no one dared speak openly anymore. Fear had done its job. James McParland never returned to the coal fields. He knew better. His name was poison there. To the Pinkertons, he was promoted. His success with the Molly Maguires became a model. Infiltrate, divide, arrest, destroy. Other industries took notes. Railroads, factories, steel mills. The lesson was clear. If workers organize, call it conspiracy. If they resist, call it terror. Then let the prisons do the rest. The strategy worked. In the years that followed, labor leaders across America were watched closely. Undercover agents joined meetings, names were recorded, friendships were tested, trust became dangerous. Many movements collapsed before they ever began. Prison did not just punish crime anymore, it prevented it, or at least prevented resistance. Yet the memory of the Molly Maguires refused to disappear. In Irish neighborhoods, their names were still spoken softly. Some called them criminals, others called them martyrs. Most called them victims of a system designed to break poor men. Historians would later uncover letters written by condemned miners, letters filled with fear, regret, and confusion. Few admitted to murder. Many insisted they had been swept up simply for belonging. Those letters never mattered in court. The label had already been applied: terrorist. Once that word appeared in print, the trials no longer needed proof. The public had already decided who deserved to die. This became the most dangerous legacy of the Molly Maguires. Not the violence, not the secret meetings, but how easily fear could erase fairness. By the early 1900s, America's prison population began to grow. Laws tightened, sentences lengthened. The idea that incarceration could solve social problems took hold. Crime was no longer just about acts, it was about identity, who you were, who you associated with, who you might become. The Molly Maguires had been judged not only for what they did, but for who they represented: poor, immigrant, angry. Replace those words and the pattern repeats. Today, the coal tunnels are mostly silent. Machines replaced men, towns emptied, graves outnumber houses. But the system built during that era still stands. Prisons remain powerful, labels remain dangerous, and the line between justice and control remains thin. The story of the Molly Maguires forces an uncomfortable question. What happens when the law serves power instead of people? What happens when prisons are used not to protect society, but to protect profit? What happens when fear becomes evidence? There is no clean ending to this story, no final verdict that satisfies everyone, only consequences. The men who were executed never lived to see safer minds. Their families never received apologies.
The system that crushed them continued, unchanged for decades. Yet their story planted a seed. Every time a worker demanded rights openly instead of secretly, every time a protest chose visibility over shadows, every time someone questioned who the prison system truly serves, that seed grew. The Molly Maguires were erased from the coalfields, but not from American history. They became a warning carved into stone and silence, a warning about desperation, a warning about betrayal, a warning about what happens when people are pushed so far that fear feels like the only weapon left. And as long as prisons exist, as long as power fears resistance, their story will remain unfinished. Because the question they left behind still has no answer. Was this justice, or was this control? In the next chapter, the story does not move forward in time. It moves inward, into the prison system itself, into how this single case helped shape incarceration as a tool of power in America. And once you see that connection, the Molly Maguires stop being history. They become a mirror. The prison doors closed long after the last execution, but their echo never faded. Inside American prisons, something had changed because of the Molly Maguires. Guards felt it, wardens felt it, lawmakers felt it. The idea had taken root that prisons were not just places to punish crimes already committed, they were tools to stop future threats before they fully formed. Fear had proven effective. After the Molly Maguires, prisons were no longer neutral spaces. They became warning signs, a message to anyone thinking about resistance. This is what happens when you challenge power. In the late 1800s, prison systems expanded quietly. New rules appeared, harsher sentences, broader definitions of conspiracy. Men could now be locked away not only for what they did, but for what authorities believed they might do. The Molly Maguires had been punished as a group, not just as individuals. That mattered. It meant association itself could become a crime. Inside prison walls, this thinking shaped daily life. Irish miners jailed during the trials described isolation, silence, and mental strain. Talking was punished. Eye contact was discouraged. Solitary confinement became common. The goal was not correction, it was control. Prison officials believed breaking a man's mind was safer than breaking his body. A silent prisoner could not organize. A broken prisoner could not resist. This philosophy spread. By the 1880s and beyond, prisons across the United States adopted stricter discipline systems, silence rules, forced labor, psychological pressure. The same methods used on the Molly Maguires were now used on thousands of others. Many inmates had never committed violent crimes. Some were labor organizers, some were political voices, some were simply poor. The line between criminal and enemy blurred. Outside prison walls, the public was told these measures kept them safe. Newspapers repeated stories of terror stopped and order restored. Few asked what happened inside the cells.
Few wanted to know, but former inmates remembered. They spoke of endless work under watchful eyes, of guards who believed kindness was weakness, of nights so quiet that men felt themselves disappearing. For Irish communities, prison became a place of inherited fear. Sons grew up knowing that speaking out could lead to iron bars, that secrecy could mean survival. This fear worked better than chains. Employers no longer needed violence. The memory of prison was enough. Yet, history has a way of circling back. As the 20th century approached, new groups began pushing for labor rights again. This time, they studied the past carefully. They learned that secrecy made movements easy targets. They learned that prisons fed on silence. So they spoke louder. Public marches replaced secret meetings. Open demands replaced whispers. Numbers replaced shadows.
The legacy of the Molly Maguires shaped these choices, even if their names were never spoken. Prison, once seen as a solution, slowly revealed its limits. Locking away anger did not remove it, it only buried it deeper. Today, when people argue about incarceration, terrorism, and justice, the same questions return. Who decides who is dangerous? Who benefits from fear? And who pays the price? The story of the Molly Maguires shows how easily power can turn prisons into weapons, how quickly labels can erase humanity, how fear can rewrite justice. And that story is not finished, because the system they helped shape still exists. Different names, different faces, same walls. In the final chapter, we step back and ask the hardest question of all. If the Molly Maguires were America's first domestic terror cell, what does that say about the country that created them? And what happens when history repeats itself? The story does not end in 1870s. It follows us. Long after the coal dust settled and the gallows were taken down, the question left by the Molly Maguires kept coming back. Not in newspapers, not in courtrooms, but in moments when power felt threatened and fear felt useful. Because once America learned that prisons could silence resistance, it never forgot. The Molly Maguires were not remembered when new laws were written. Their names were not spoken when new prisons were built. But their case was there, hidden underneath the logic. If a group scares those in power, label it dangerous. If it organizes quietly, call it conspiracy. If it fights back, call it terror. Then lock it away. This pattern appeared again and again. Labor organizers jailed, protest leaders imprisoned, communities watched closely, infiltrated, divided. The same playbook, rewritten with different faces. And each time, the public was told the same thing. This is for safety. This is for order. This is justice. But the Molly Maguires remind us that justice depends on who tells the story. To mine owners, they were violent criminals who used fear to control an industry. To the state, they were a threat that needed to be eliminated. To many miners, they were the only voice left when the law refused to listen. All of these can be true at the same time. That is what makes this story uncomfortable. Violence did happen. People were killed. Fear was used as a weapon. Those facts cannot be erased, but neither can the conditions that created that violence: hunger, exploitation, silence. A system where poor men had no power except the one they took for themselves. When prisons stepped in, they did not fix those problems, they buried them. The executions brought quiet, not fairness, order, not justice. The mines became safer decades later, not because of the hangings, but because workers eventually fought in the open and refused to disappear. The Molly Maguires lost because they fought in the dark, but their story taught others how to fight in the light. Today, when we hear words like terrorist, extremist, dangerous group, the echo of the 1870s is still there. The label comes first, the fear follows, the prison waits. That does not mean prisons are always wrong. It means they are powerful, and power, when unchecked, repeats itself. The men who died on the gallows never got to tell their full story. James McParland never stood trial for his role. The courts never asked whether justice had been rushed to satisfy those with money and influence. History moved on, but the question stayed. Were the Molly Maguires America's first domestic terror cell, or were they America's first warning? A warning about what happens when people are pushed into corners, when law serves profit, when fear replaces fairness, when prisons become answers instead of last resorts. That warning still matters, because the moment a society decides who is dangerous without listening, the moment punishment becomes easier than understanding, the moment prisons are used to silence instead of protect, the Molly Maguires are no longer history. They are present, and the story starts again.
This is not just a true crime documentary. It is a mirror, and what you see in it depends on where you stand. If this story made you question who justice really serves, you're not alone. Every week, we uncover the real crimes hidden behind history and prison walls. These stories don't end when the credits roll. They live on in our system today. Subscribe, stay with us, and don't miss the next truth they never wanted told.